Well, the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, is testifying today at the COVID inquiry. He played a key role, of course, in the UK's response to the pandemic.
He says that Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, caused the toxic culture at the heart of government. Right, let's speak to GB News presenter Pip Thompson, who is outside the COVID inquiry for us. Pip, can you bring us the very latest?
Good afternoon to you both. Well, it didn't take that long, did it, for the subject of Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former most senior advisor, to come up. And Matt Hancock has been questioned. I'm sorry, there's a lot of noise behind me because there are bereaved relatives speaking this lunchtime while the inquiry takes a break. So let me just try and carry on. But Hugo Keith, the lead counsel for the inquiry, asked Matt Hancock about these general sweeping allegations that he lied, the former Health Secretary lied allegedly during the pandemic. And these allegations came from Dominic Cummings, amongst others. And he said, Matt Hancock, that there is no evidence whatsoever for that. He said there was a great deal of hard work on our side, as in the Department of Health and Social Care, and there was a toxic culture that we had to work with, which seemed to want to find people to blame. And Matt Hancock very much blamed Dominic Cummings for creating this toxic culture. He called him a malign actor and said that his influence was deeply frustrating. Just take a listen to this.
Mr. Cummings was not one of the people who, against whom it might be said that he was resisting.
The inquiry can, if it chooses, get to the bottom of each of the specific allegations because they are not true, and I'm very happy to write with an explanation of each and every one of them. The impact of the toxic culture that essentially was caused by the chief advisor, but that clearly I can now see, not that I knew at the time, others were brought into, that was unhelpful.
From me, Lucy from the West Midlands. We know that doing away with COVID mitigations is the government.
Well, really fascinating to hear what he is saying there, because of course many people might think that Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock are on the same side of these arguments, but clearly there is some bitter resentment between these two individuals.
Interestingly, it seems that Matt Hancock has had to, he's had to say, I am not a liar. He's had to deny being a liar to the KC there at the COVID inquiry. Some people may have different opinions on Matt Hancock, very much a controversial character throughout the pandemic and, of course, with hindsight as well.
There's particular consternation over whether or not Matt Hancock had advised Boris Johnson to deliver a lockdown on the 14th of March. That is contested by others, and this led to this perhaps a little bit testy exchange. But, of course, that's not the only issue in the whole of this discussion, not just when lockdown was advised to go in, or indeed when it was sort of conjured up as an idea in and of itself. There were more issues, of course, and one of those most particular at the forefront of people's minds is, of course, the care home crisis, particularly in that first wave.
Yes, Matt Hancock's role in that. He was criticised very much around his policy of care homes, protecting care homes. Joining us now is the owner of Crabtree Care Homes, David Crabtree. David, thank you very much for joining us. I understand. What would you like to ask Matt Hancock if you were there at the inquiry and you had his ear?
I'd like to start by giving my condolences to Mr. Darling's family, who epitomised that of a great minister, as opposed to Mr. Hancock, who I would directly ask him, where was this ring of protection? If you were not lying, where was the ring of protection that you said to the House was in place to not only to protect the elderly in care homes, but every member of social care staff was put at risk with no PPE, and they knew that. And we were sending people into care homes untested. On the 28th of March, he issued a directive to say that you did not need to test asymptomatic. And yet in this morning's inquiry in Italy, we were assured that it was happening in February.
It's interesting, we're expecting to get to this section of the inquiry after lunch, and we will no doubt hear some of these questions. No doubt Matt Hancock has previously been challenged over whether or not he followed the advice of Chris Whitty and other advisors over care home dismissals, or rather hospital dismissals into care homes. He's contested those reports in the past. What's your understanding of that disagreement?
It comes back to being a minister, and he actually said this morning he was the minister for the people, and the scientific evidence was there, or it was doubtful, or it was dubious, or this. As a minister, his duty was to protect the people of the country, and he failed miserably. A deluded man will always believe his truth, and it would be no amount of questioning will change Mr. Hancock's delusional state of what he believed was right. There are 4 people, apparently, who have said that he lied to them in Downing Street. So I cannot believe him, and I certainly would ask him for his evidence of where the ring of protection was for care home and, more importantly, for social care staff.
Do you have any sympathy, David, with the argument that the pandemic was once in a generation, many decisions had to be made with the circumstances ever-changing quickly, and that now with hindsight we can see perhaps where decisions were made wrongly? But do you have any sympathy with the idea that the government was working under extremely difficult circumstances?
None whatsoever. Typhoid Mary, 1800s. We know what we do in hospitals and care homes when we have outbreaks of flu. We prevent people from coming in. All the hotels were closed. Why we didn't use those as a firebreaker, it was just common sense. I have no idea. The incompetence is just beyond understanding, to be honest.
And yet this was a novel pandemic, a virus no one had ever seen before, came out of the blue from Wuhan, China, although, of course, the COVID inquiry is not allowed to talk about where on earth this virus came from and whether or not it was man-made. But clearly this was something that governments hadn't handled before. They didn't know if it could be transmitted asymptomatically or symptomatically. That was a big disagreement and discussion at the start of things. Do you have any sympathy with the sort of barrage of conflicting advice that these politicians were receiving?
No, because yesterday was evident from emails between the pantomime dames that the elderly were collateral. If we must send them to care homes, we must. Now, you may well say, well, people who are elderly were, potential collateral, but not the 22-year-old mother of a child that then has to go home from social care work with no PPE back to her own family. There was no consideration for the spreading of the disease, regardless of whether they were symptomatic or not. We admitted 2 patients. We were forced to readmit 2 patients back into our care on the 28th of March, and within 10 days we had 9 deaths.
Well, thank you. David, thank you very much for your time. David Crabtree, there, owner of Crabtree Care Homes. As we said before, we're expecting the inquiry to touch upon care homes, to mention care homes, after the lunch break. So we'll bring you the latest from that.
No, absolutely shocking there, the number of deaths from care homes at the start of the pandemic, although I suppose we must remember that by the end of the pandemic, the UK was pretty much in the middle of the pack, whereas all of these news reports at the start said that we were the worst. By the end of it, we ended up muddling through somewhere in the middle.